Thank you once again for joining us on this graveyard session. So thank you very much for joining us. Today we will be talking about gaining visibility within your environment, security visibility within your environment using the NETCB security and compliance solution that we offer. So before I actually go into a demonstration of the solution, I just have a couple of slides that I want to go through just to create some background and give you some additional information with regards to our solution. Okay, so first thing I'd like to talk about is just how cyber attacks occur nowadays. A lot of my customers are still under the impression that as long as they've got something like a firewall in place, perhaps something like a VPN that users can connect to, and they run antivirus, etc., on the workstations and the servers and so forth, that they are reasonably protected. And the reality is that they are not. Cyber attacks have become much more sophisticated over the years. So there's different methods of doing things like privilege escalation, lateral movement, etc., that doesn't even require things like malware. So at no point is their file actually downloaded to the device that your antivirus, etc., can pick up. Also, with the proliferation of things like social engineering attacks, phishing attacks, etc., where individuals willingly hand over their credentials or are scammed into handing over their credentials. Those individuals, you also need to be able to detect when their credentials are being used within malicious activities, etc. So I'd like to take you just through this slide really to explain to you how a modern cyber day attack typically occurs. Point number 0 here, or where the starting point is typically is target recognition. At this point, the attacker might have identified your organization or you as an individual. And the reason behind that might be a multitude of reasons. It might be because of hacktivism. They might not like what your company is doing. They might be after your intellectual property. It might just be an opportunistic hacker that might have found the credentials, or perhaps found a vulnerability within one of your devices. The next step really is to gain access to the initial endpoint. Now, this could also happen, as I mentioned, through something like a phishing attack, gaining access to a user's credentials and using that to log on to a different application or service, etc. It might also be because of a vulnerability that's exposed through one of your internet-facing devices, or an internal device, even if the attacker already has access to the environment. Now, recently, earlier this week, late last week, there was a 0-day vulnerability disclosed for Cisco devices, iOS XE devices, which is got a CVSS score of 10. So it really is a simple task of gaining access to those devices utilizing the existing vulnerability. Be that as it may, once they've got access to that endpoint, could be a Cisco device like I just mentioned, or endpoint device, etc. Typically, the information that the attacker is after is not located on that device, right? Because it doesn't help they ransomware an end user's workstation or something like a web server, etc. Yes, it might not reflect good on the company, but that's not what they're after. Because what they ultimately want to do is they want to find the crown jewels of the organization, the information that really makes the organization tick, and they want to hold that for ransom so they can profit from it. That's the end goal. So once they've got access to that initial endpoint, they would like to do privilege escalation. Typically, they'll do privilege escalation, see how much access they can get and how many privileges they can get on that device where they are located or already have access. They then go through a cyclical process of doing lateral movement, privilege escalation, etc. So how that works is, firstly, from that device where they now have sufficient privileges, they will start to do additional enumeration of the network and applications and services that they have access to. Once again, the idea behind this is ultimately to gain access to the crown jewels of that organization. So infrastructure enumeration, that would be things like port scans, etc., enumerating Active Directory if you have that in your infrastructure. And through infrastructure enumeration, etc., they will start to perform lateral movement, moving from one device to the next, etc. In that, as I mentioned, in that cyclical manner, once they've got access to an additional device, do a local privilege escalation, gain additional privileges, move on to the next device until they find the crown jewels of that organization, at which point they will then either start to exfiltrate that information, so they've got a copy of it. Once that's done, typically they will then encrypt it and let you know that they have access, exclusive access to your information, and then hold you to ransom. The main point to note here is, as I mentioned, through the cyclical process of privilege escalation, lateral movement, privilege escalation, lateral movement, etc. At no point in modern cyber attacks is malware necessarily being used. So at no point is there necessarily a file being downloaded to the device. So your antivirus will never actually detect most of these attacks. What you need to take note of is the fact that these privilege escalation lateral movement attacks in modern day attacks actually involve the abuse of existing processes within the technology sphere. So if you have something like Active Directory in place, typically your Kerberos attacks, golden ticket, silver ticket attacks, it's merely the manipulation of existing processes and authorized processes within your environment. And the only way you can adequately protect your organization against those type of threats is by gaining visibility into everything that's happening within your environment. And that's exactly where our security and compliance tool plays a role. It allows you to see within your environment what is happening with regards to security. So it allows you to firstly detect when things go wrong, and part of this process, be able to stop the attack before it gets to a point of exfiltrating your data and encrypting your information, etc. Okay, so just some features and benefits of our security and compliance tool. So firstly, it's a very comprehensive solution that we have. Not only does it include things like security event auditing and reporting, it also includes things like integrity monitoring. So being able to analyze and report changes to files, directories, registry settings, etc. It also has a configuration assessment component, being able to assess your configuration of your existing devices against what is deemed best practices by something like the CIS benchmarks, etc. There's also features like vulnerability management, etc. So it really is a very comprehensive solution. Where possible, we make use of open source components as well as community-driven efforts. So that is in an effort to really keep the solution cost effective. So what we end up doing is not forcing our customers to subscribe to additional services, etc., to enrich information. It's all included in our solution, and there is no additional charges to it. So if I look at something like the National Vulnerability Database and the CIS benchmarks, there's no additional costs involved for your organization to actually subscribe to that information through our solution. It's flexible. We've got 3 different bundles. So depending on your budget, your requirements, etc., we can customize the solution to really fit within your environment and what you would like to get out of it. The information we provide is relevant, so we can differentiate between something like a user that's forgotten his password versus an actual brute force attack, and I will actually show that in our demo. And as I mentioned earlier, it's all standards-based, open source driven, as well as driven by the community itself. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on the slide, so I can actually get to the demonstration itself. But one of the main features of our solution is actually security analytics. How that works is we ingest information from all the different devices within your environment. So these devices, as I mentioned earlier, could include your firewalls, your server devices, your end user desktops, including things like web and application servers and so forth, even reverse proxies. So we ingest all that information and we analyze that for specific security events. By doing that, we can actually start to create alerts and reports around things like logins, failed authentication attempts, attacks such as brute force attacks, password spray attacks, credential replay, including things like even malware detection and unauthorized processes, etc. As part of my demonstration, I will also show you what it actually looks like when a web server, one of our web servers, is attacked by using an existing vulnerability. It also features intrusion detection, not only host-based, but also network-based intrusion detection. So on the devices that's being managed by our solution, we can automatically detect different events taking place, suspicious activities, hidden files, and all those type of things. Even if a new network port is opened on that device, we can report on that to ensure that people are updated and your incident response teams know when these things are happening. We also feature network-based intrusion detection. So based on packets that's traversing the network, being able to detect different attacks such as SQL injection attacks, etc., just based on analyzing the packets that's traversing the network. So even on those devices that's not actively being monitored by our solution, we are also able to detect attacks, etc., in the environment. In terms of integrity monitoring, this is where we monitor changes to files and directories as well as the registry. So not only in the sense of permissions and ownerships and attributes, but also in activities. When somebody adds a file or deletes a file or modifies a file, we can even go as far as actually capturing the content that's been changed in those files, so you can actually see what has changed. And then, of course, for your Windows environments, what's critical is to be able to monitor what's happening in the registry, because that is where the most of the security configuration within the Windows environment is actually located. So if somebody were to change a configuration that might reduce the security on one of your Windows devices, automatically that will also be recorded. Vulnerability monitoring. So in this feature, what we do is we actually firstly create an inventory of your devices. These devices can include Windows, Linux, as well as Mac OS devices. So we build an inventory which includes hardware, software, as well as the patch information. And based on that, we compare it to the National Vulnerability Database to detect and report any known vulnerabilities associated with the software contained in that inventory. So we are not a direct competitor to something like a Nessus, where we do vulnerability scanning, because that will take, that takes it a step further, where it will actually find the login form and try and access the application using default credentials, etc. Our solution does not do that. But our solution will be able to accurately be able to tell you when software is installed on a device that does include vulnerabilities. So it's a good first line of defense to ensure that your environment is patched, that known vulnerabilities are remediated, and so forth. In the configuration assessment, as I mentioned earlier, what we do there is we actually create a baseline of your existing devices. So we actually assess your existing device. We give it a score, how it relates to what is deemed best practices by the CIS benchmark. So the more you align with that benchmark, the higher the score. The less you align, the lower the score, obviously. It also provides you with various things like the remediation steps to enable you to harden your configuration yourself without relying on third-party suppliers such as ourselves, etc. So not only will it highlight the configuration item on your devices that needs to be hardened, it will also tell you how to do it, as well as how to test that it has been done now. In terms of compliance monitoring, we provide reports for items like PCI DSS, which is related mainly to the payment card industry, HIPAA, very much related to the healthcare industry in the US, GDPR, it's the data protection regulations, the European data protection regulations. NIST 853 is very closely aligned to ISO 27001. So we can actually utilize those reports to also show how your ISO 27001 controls are functioning within your environment. And then we are also working on getting some POPIA compliance reporting built into the solution as well. We also do monitoring for cloud environments. So if you have infrastructure in Amazon, Azure, or Google, or if you use something like Office 365, or AD in Azure, we can also monitor those devices. So we can monitor Active Directory in Azure, Office 365, etc. But also, if you have infrastructure deployed, we can deploy the agent on those devices, and they are fully monitored by our solution as well. And then lastly, if you have Docker containers, we can also monitor those containers or those machines by monitoring the behavior, also identifying things like vulnerabilities, anomalies, etc. If somebody were to spawn a shell within one of those Docker containers, even that will be detected. Okay, let me move over to the actual demonstration of our solution. So I like to start on this screen. I did a brief introduction this morning. So essentially, this is the landing page for our solution, and it gives you a nice breakdown of the various functional areas within the solution itself. Before I go into those areas, let me just go to agents to show you what the typical devices we are currently monitoring within our environment. So you'll notice there's quite a lot of devices which include Linux servers, Debian Linux, Microsoft Windows servers, SLES servers, etc. These can include virtual servers, physical servers, etc. But quite a big environment that includes, as I mentioned, some Windows devices, workstations, servers, Active Directory servers. There's a SharePoint server or two in here as well. If I go back to modules, and I go back to modules directly, as I mentioned, these are the different functional areas. I will start with security events. So in our environment, what I like to do is to log in every morning and take a look at what has happened within the last 24 hours within my environment. So as you can see from this item here, you can set specific time frames. So last 7 days, last 30 days, 90 days, year, etc. All depend on how much data you are actually storing. Last 15 minutes. But you can also go to a specific point in time. So if you find out in hindsight that last week sometime some anomaly happened within the environment, you can go back to that specific point and actually analyze what took place. At the top here, you'll notice some summary information. So you'll notice that there has been 148,000 events over the last 24 hours. Zero of them had a risk score of 12 and above. We had one authentication failure and about 95, almost 96,000 successful authentication attempts. I mentioned this earlier, the risk score. So each and every event that is ingested in our solution is assigned a risk score, depending on how severe that event might be. I can also scroll down, and if I take a look at each one of these individual events, you can see that it's been timestamped. It tells you which device that event came from. If you make use of something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, you can also see that it's got the MITRE ATT&CK technique and tactic associated with it. It gives you a description of what actually changed, and you can see in this case it was a registry value integrity checksum changed, and it's got a risk score of 5 associated with it. So any high risk events with a level 12 or above will automatically be populated at the top here, and you can actually search on that. If I go back, and let's say for the last 7 days, you'll notice that there were 5 level 12 or above alerts. I can click on that and actually filter to see what has happened specifically there. In this case, you can see on the one server, it detected a vulnerability that's got a risk score of 13. Let me close that quickly. What I then also like to do, let me switch this back to the last 24 hours, is to expand this item, which is top MITRE attacks. So essentially, this is a description of the top events that took place in the last 24 hours. So you can see there's quite a lot of activities here. Things that might be of interest is create account. Let's go take a look at what happened in that instance. If I scroll down, you can see immediately that it seems like there was a computer account created within our environment, and I can see all the information neatly captured as to what was created, when, by who, etc. Okay, so that event checks out. I know that new service has been installed specifically as part of our demonstrations, etc. for this week. So let me see what else we can find. Okay, there's another interesting one. Network sniffing. Let's go take a look at what that entails. So let me minimize that again. Okay, and I can see on one of these SECOM devices, the interface entered promiscuous mode. So what does that mean? That device, that interface, network interface on that specific device is now able to do packet sniffing. So that's a big problem, and I'll tell you why. If you have any unencrypted or clear text information traversing the network, something like LDAP queries over a clear text port 389, etc., this device will be able to capture that information and read things like passwords, etc. So this is important to take note of. Let me clear that event again. And let's see one other event. Maybe there's something else. Let's see, account manipulation. That also might relate to that computer account that was changed. Correct, yes. Okay, so let's get some interesting things going here. I'm going to switch this to the last 15 minutes. So we've got some more relevant information to work with. Now you can see there's 2,661 events. 0 of them were the level 12 or above, 0 authentication failures, and 955 successful authentication attempts. So what I'm going to do next is to actually start to create some, firstly create a failed logging onto a Windows device, an Active Directory server, and then this might take a minute or two. I'm also going to create some failed SSH logins to some Linux devices, etc. So let's start to populate that information. So now I've got 0 failed authentication failures. So let's refresh this and see if that now starts to increment. There we go. So because of those failed authentication attempts, it's now immediately alerted us to that. You can see that there's 6 failed authentication failures. What you won't notice at this stage on the right-hand side, these top MITRE tactics, is that there's no brute force alert. Okay, so we had 6 failed authentications. I can summarize them. But as I mentioned, there's no brute force attack yet registered, which is correct because we just logged in using incorrect credentials. There's no attack yet. So if I scroll down, let me just refresh this quickly again. And I can actually see there's the failed login attempts to the Linux device. Here's the failed login attempt to Active Directory. If I were to expand this specific event, you can see that all the information is neatly captured. I can see the account that I used to attempt authentication, against which server it was, my IP address. This is the IP address that I used from the VPN. So all of the information neatly captured. If I go to one of the failed SSH authentication attempts, same story. Username neatly captured, the IP address, etc. So everything neatly captured for you to now start to investigate. But at this stage, it's just a case of this account perhaps having forgotten his password. So what I'm going to do next is to actually launch a brute force attack against one of our Active Directory servers. So this might take a minute or two to register all those failed authentication attempts, get them through to the system, etc. But as soon as this counter hits around probably around 16 or so, it will register a brute force attack, and then we can actually start to analyze that. So let me start by just refreshing. We're up to 9 failed authentication attempts now, up to 10, 11, 12. Let's give it some more time. 13. There we go. So now you'll notice that there's a new category that popped up here called brute force. I can now select that and filter purely on that to see only brute force attempts within this environment. If I now scroll down, I can see that against the Windows Active Directory server, there were multiple Windows logon failures. I can expand this, and once again, it's got all my information captured, the account, the IP address, and also each and every failed authentication attempt neatly captured for you to now go and further analyze what took place here. I'm going to clear these filters so we can take a look at the real information. So what we still don't see here is level 12 or above alerts. What I'm going to do next is to actually generate a level 15 alert by exploiting an existing vulnerability on our web server. So this should now trigger a event for us. Let's refresh. There we go. I now have one level 12 or above alert. I can filter on that. If I scroll down, I can see, on one of our CRM servers, there's been a shell shock attack detected. I can once again expand this event, and if I actually click on there, you can see once again all the information neatly captured, and I can see through this vulnerability, the attacker used cat, which is a Linux editor, to attempt to read the etc parswd file. Okay. Once again, the IP address for our reverse proxy gives us some more information with regards to the actual vulnerability that's been exploited and so forth. Okay, let me clear this. Next, I want to show you, let me switch this back to 24 hours, some of the other functions within the environment. So let me go back to modules. Integrity monitoring. This is where we report on changes to directories, files, and the registry itself. So you can see it's been capturing over the last 24 hours, this information. This can also be set to real time. So we can set the second a file is edited, if you've got a very sensitive file environment, as soon as a specific sensitive file is edited, immediately send an alert with a level 15, etc., risk event, and so forth. So all of this is highly customizable. But over here, I can see a nice summary of what's changed within my environment. Let's just say I want to see what files have been deleted over the last 24-hour period. Once again, I can see that there's 258 files on the CRM server and 115 files on the Vibe server by this user account and by this user account respectively. In this case, I just want to see what has happened on the CRM server. So once again, I can filter on that and I can go to events. Now that I'm in events, give it a second to display the information. And immediately I can see exactly what files have been deleted or modified within the environment. So I can also expand this, see exactly the IP address for the agent, what the file was, and what changed, who changed it. In the case of privileges, it will also capture what privileges or what file rights were changed. So if somebody were given read-write access to a file or read access to a file, all of that information will be captured. What I'm going to do is to go back to modules, policy monitoring. This is where we will see deviations from the policies that's been set within the environment. So in this case, you can see that there's a Trojan version of a file has been detected. File is present on the dev-dev. It also detected a rootkit on one of our devices. And then also, there's an interesting one, a file owned by root, but written permissions by anybody. So that is potentially a way of privilege escalation with this environment, because if that file is owned by root, it might also be an executable file. And if I've got rights to that file, I can create something like a reverse shell entry to that next time root runs that file. Or if that file is run with root privileges, it will create a reverse shell back to my device. So once again, important to note. If I go back to modules, system auditing, there might not be anything in here at the moment. Let me switch that back to the last 7 days. This is where we can detect things like processes that crashed, configuration changes, etc. In this case, I can filter on this. And if I view, it just shows me that, in this case, a specific process ended abnormally. I can once again click on events, and I can see exactly what process ended abnormally, why did a full log entry of the information, etc. So even for people with GroupWise, one of our customers has a GroupWise environment. If one of their GroupWise agents fail, even that is being reported in this specific module. Let me go back to modules, system configuration assessment. This is where we compare a existing device configuration to what is deemed best practices. So let me select this server as an example. You can see here in this case, it's applied the CIS Debian benchmarks, and we passed on 66 items. We failed on 119 items, and 7 is not applicable. This gives us a score of 35. So let me just go back to that, select that device again. So this now gives me a score of 35%. So that's great. You want to have that information, but it doesn't really help you if you don't know how to increase that score. But that's once again simple, because you just click on that link itself and it will actually show you the items that you fail as well as the items that you pass. So I can filter on passed items, or I can filter on failed items. If I now filter on the failed items, I can also expand it, and it will tell me, firstly, the rationale behind why this is considered a security issue, as well as how to fix it. And then lastly, how to actually check that this has now been remediated. This configuration item has been remediated. Now, bear in mind that it is typically these misconfiguration items that is typically being exploited for things like privilege escalation and lateral movement. So it is critical for you to harden your environment, to increase dwell time if you have an existing attacker within your environment, or at the very least eliminate that privilege escalation or lateral movement within your environment. I can do the same for a Windows device. Let me select a Windows server. I can select this one. Once again, you can see it scores, it's got two different benchmarks applied to it. For the one, it scores 64%. For the other one, 69%. Once again, I can expand it, and it will tell me exactly in this Windows environment what needs to be changed in order to increase my hardening score. I'm going to untick this host. Let me go back to modules. Next item is vulnerabilities. So as I mentioned, this allows you to see which vulnerabilities are currently associated with which device. You can immediately also see that I've selected the NETCB Jitsi device. It's got 7 critical vulnerabilities, 68 high vulnerabilities, 117 medium ones, and then 11 low vulnerabilities. As with the previous items, I can now also sort this by a specific one, and I can also sort it by the CVSS score. This allows me to now remediate the most important or most critical vulnerabilities first. I can also expand any of those vulnerabilities, and I can click on this View External References link, which will then provide me with additional resources related to that specific vulnerability, including things like how to fix it. These are direct links from Ubuntu as an example. But this one specifically I wanted to take a look at. So this is a direct link to the National Vulnerability Database, which will then tell you also why it's that specific vulnerability, the severity, as well as additional links as to how to remediate it and so forth. Okay, let me go unselect that one, and let me go back to modules. I see I've got about a minute and 30 seconds left. As I mentioned, we also have other integrations to something like VirusTotal, where we actually compare the hashes of files, etc., that's being downloaded to devices, compare that using VirusTotal through their API to see if it's malicious files, etc. We can also enrich data by doing queries with regards to DNS lookups. So if you've got workstations in your environment and we monitor the DNS server, we can actually capture domain requests. So when there's somebody who's trying to or something on a device is trying to reach out to malicious domain, automatically that will also be recorded and so forth. Okay, I think I've got 40 seconds left. If there's any questions, feel free to ask them now. I don't think we have much time. Also, you are more than welcome to reach out to any representative from NETCB if you'd like to have additional information or perhaps have a personalized demo or proof of concept on the solution itself. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.